Yeah, we have the 4 panelists, myself and you, and then we have 3 people who are watching. So I think everybody
Okay, great.
What they need.
All right, wonderful. Thanks so much, Jackie. All right, so we can get started then. Good afternoon. Welcome to the 3rd session of the University of Oregon's Undergraduate Research Symposium and to our panel entitled Beyond the Melody. Today we have 4 excellent presentations representing a breadth of expertise, and this promises to be, I think, a very enriching discussion. So my name is Tera, and I will be the primary moderator today. Jackie is our secondary moderator, and she will be helping us navigate Zoom and anything tech related, so I'm very happy that she's here. As for our format and agenda today, our session runs from 1:30 to 3:00 p.m. Each of the presenters will have 12 minutes to give their presentation. And at the end of the session, I will open the floor to our non-presenter guests for a general discussion and Q&A. So we are all here to honor the work that these excellent undergraduate students have done over the year. And so I'll ask everyone to be respectful of each other and the presenters. All non-presenter guests, thank you for joining. And please make sure that you're muted with your video off for the duration of the session, at least until we get to the Q&A portion. All presenters, I'll ask that you remain muted unless you're presenting or responding to the Q&A. Q&A will be happening at the end of the session once all presentations are complete. If you have questions to submit, you may do so in the session chat, but I'll ask that you don't write anything else in the chat as it may cause a distraction during the presentations. I will be keeping time, so presenters, I'll give you a nudge. Verbally, I'll interject a brief time call, about 12 to 13 minutes, and you'll know then that you should be wrapping up your presentation. Okay. And finally, I'll direct questions and answers at the end of the presentations. So before we get started, do you have any questions, my presenters? No questions? All right, great. So we will go in order of the program, which means we will start with Billy O'Brien. So Billy, if you wouldn't mind unmuting yourself. Billy is majoring in philosophy. Right? His paper is entitled A Critical Examination of Abstraction in John Dewey's Reflective Thought. So Billy, whenever you want to take it away, we're very excited to hear what you have done your research on.
All right, great. Thank you for this opportunity, and thank you for accepting my abstract. Funny enough, my paper is on abstraction itself, which is great and fitting. So yeah, the purpose of my paper was to examine the use of abstraction, and specifically I wanted to examine it in John Dewey's context of reflective thought. So let me just define some terms here so we can understand what my claim is at the end, and my example will make sense. So what is abstraction and how should we understand it in terms of my paper is we need to understand abstraction in a very practical way. So I use his term of pragmatic abstraction. So following the lead of John Dewey, I understand abstraction as that which is first a release from present experience and then a transfer back to present experience. And this is a tool that allows us to go beyond what is merely just directly present and to speculate about something, to imagine something, and then to apply it back to experience. So I think this is a really critical and essential human capacity that we have. And I'm really willing to extend it to beyond just a human capacity and to other animals. I'm not sure, but my research really just reflected, it was just about the human capacity. So I'm going to focus on that. But it's really, for me, to be understood as a tool and a capacity so that we're not relegated solely to the realm of what is directly in front of us. So with this, I was really interested in this tool, and I wanted to examine it in a context that is really present all the time. So I took up the context of John Dewey's reflective thought. And I'm going to read a quick passage on how he defines it, and then I'll put it in my own words because it's kind of, I think it's kind of convoluted the way he puts it. He says, active, persistent, and careful consideration of any belief or supposed form of knowledge in the light of the grounds that support it and the further conclusions to which it tends constitutes reflective thought. So at first I was kind of like, what the heck does that mean? But in simple terms, it's just that we have a problem at hand and we want to solve it. And we want to solve it on the basis of evidence that's present in experience. And we want to solve it with regard to what outcome we would like, preferably a successful outcome that solves our problem. So he distinguishes this type of thought from any thought that runs through our head, because that would be too general. That would be too much of a task for me, I think, to take up in my paper, examining the tool. And he also distinguishes it from anything that is baseless. So not just a story that a kid tells that a kid imagines in their head and has no basis in experience. So with that distinction, he makes it clear that we're really dealing with a problem and how to solve this problem practically. So much like the tool of abstraction is understood practically, in my paper, reflective thought is very much a practical endeavor. So specifically, to get a little bit more detailed with reflective thought, it moves from the present facts of experience and it moves to suggestions. So that's the part that goes beyond the present. It's almost speculative. And then once we're in the suggestions, this is what really suggests a solution to our problem. And once we have this, once it pops into our mind from whatever previous knowledge we have, previous experience that pertains to the problem, once we have this in our minds, we need to crucially, this is the part that I stress, we need to crucially bring this suggestion back to experience to test it out, to see if this suggestion is successful to solve our problem. And I was really interested in the success part of this practical endeavor because I took up an example in law to really show that the success that he draws out in his notion of reflective thought it's kind of problematic because it doesn't take into a consideration of whose success we're bringing about. It just merely says that we want practical, successful consequences to come about. And sure, this makes sense for a lot of things we do. Say, I'm cold right now, so I put on a jacket, but I'm still cold, so I have a problem, right? And then I look around, see what pertains to the problem. I see that, oh, my window's open. That could suggest to me that, hey, maybe if I close the window, then I can solve my problem. But I need to practically get to that window to close it to then hopefully solve the present problem at hand. That's just an example of reflective thought. And that's just a simple one. But when it comes to a case of law where, say, I took up an example of the reasonable woman standard. It was a standard that replaced the reasonable person standard in law with reference to sexual harassment cases. So the first case I took up, I think, really exemplifies why the consideration of whose success is a really crucial thing to take into account when we're using this tool of pragmatic abstraction to engage in reflective thought. So the first case is about a woman who brings a sexual harassment suit for a hostile work environment claim, where she claims that her coworkers were using obscene language. Her supervisors were using derogatory terms specifically towards women. They were hanging nude posters in the common work environment, and that was offensive to her. So she brought it to the court to get some sort of redress. But this court used a standard that was not the reasonable woman standard. It was, in fact, the reasonable person standard, which I think is exemplary for not considering whose success we're practically dealing with. So by using this standard, the court ended up judging that, like, she didn't get any redress because the reasoning was that, oh, well, boys will be boys. Just the practical success that was considered was in the context of the men and not the woman who was bringing the suit. And I found that really problematic and illustrative of why the claim of whose success in reflective thought is important. And moving to the next example, I don't know how much time I have left, but I should be good, is one that does consider the reasonable woman standard. And that, I think, is really illustrative of why the consideration of whose success we're practically dealing with when we use the tool of pragmatic abstraction in reflective thought, why it's really important. So in this case, it was very similar. A woman was working in an environment that she claimed was a hostile work environment. Very much of the same things were going on. There were supervisors that were using obscene language regularly, coworkers, same thing, posters, magazines, you name it. She claimed it was a hostile work environment, and the judges, recognizing the practical significance of this case, how it was specific to a woman's experience and not to be judged by anybody else's experience except for hers, that they recognized it and they used the reasonable woman standard, which precisely does the opposite of the reasonable person standard, which doesn't differentiate anything at all. The reasonable woman standard actually differentiates and asks, whose success are we dealing with and what standard should we apply so we can bring about the best practical consequences that make sense in this situation. And I really liked exploring that example because I thought it bolstered my claim that we really need to look back into John Dewey's claim and reconsider it. And when we reconsider it, we can more appropriately, usefully, helpfully, ethically, carefully, like, it just gets immensely better the way that we can use this essential tool of pragmatic abstraction, and especially in the context of reflective thought. And I was really interested in the practical aspect of things because when I hear the term abstraction, I don't know about y'all, but I think of this really lofty term that's something like detached from experience that has no felt bearing on experience. But that's why I was really interested in Dewey, because he understands abstraction not as something detached, but as something that is very felt and has a bearing on experience. And same thing with reflective thought. His philosophy is pragmatism, so he's very much into judging results by the outcome that they have in experience. And I was very interested in that too, hence why I wrote a philosophy thesis on critically examining the tool of abstraction in reflective thought. And I just think this reconsideration will prove immensely useful, not only for my thought, but it proved useful in the courts. And I think that's a very powerful system that it influenced. And yeah, that's all I have to say. By considering whose success we're practically bringing about, I think that's a necessary consideration that needs to be brought into John Dewey's notion of reflective thought, and will just prove useful when we use the tool of pragmatic abstraction in our daily lives. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Billy, for that really excellent presentation. So if you have questions specific to Billy's presentation right now, I'll invite you to post those in the webinar chat, or you can hold on to them until we get to the Q&A period at the end of our session today. Thank you very much, Billy.
Cool. Thank you, Tara.
So next we're going to move on to Joelle Ahler, who majors in cinema studies with minors in women and gender studies and ethnic studies. Joelle's paper is entitled Disrupting the Cyclical Narrative of Castration in Rape Revenge, Distinguishing Violence from Vengeance. Thank you very much, Joelle.
Hello. So my general thesis is rape revenge narratives falsely construct castration as a tool for vengeance and reclamation of bodily autonomy to perpetuate binary understandings of sexual violence and patriarchal systems of power within these narratives. As a general disclaimer, I'll be analyzing rape and castration explicitly. So if you should feel uncomfortable with these topics, I would suggest muting my presentation for the time being. So when I first started this, I wanted to deconstruct how rape and castration and rape revenge were often talked about in equalizing terms. In doing my research, I found that castration necessitates a colonial structure of gender and upholds false narratives that reclaim feminine power by constructing a perspective of feminized vengeance in the place of justice for the victims. When I started, I largely viewed them as movies made for men by men, with castration as sort of a handoff or compensation to audiences for creating a genre that employs voyeuristic perspective of sexual violence. So for this project, I'll be working from the assumptive understanding or familiarity with rape culture as a social structure and conditioning within media, specifically understanding the power dynamics presented in these films from a post-colonial standpoint of feminism. The patriarchal forms of power and abuse that distinguish women as physically and mentally inferior to men also conditions their bodies as a currency for ownership. The social construction of gender orchestrates men as the standard, and from a colonial lens, masculinity is born from the possessive investment over materials, objects, and land as currency, while orchestrating violence as a necessity in order to defend and maintain this power. With men as the standard, women are constructed within this reflection. The ideas of femininity and womanhood are naturalized, and that women's central objective or scope of identity is tied to their body. Thus, women's bodies and autonomies are physical spaces to be claimed and possessed as a validation of masculine colonial power. The structure informs the socialization of gender norms in our society and conditions an inferiority complex that objectifies women for the purpose of maintaining hegemonic power as a result. Rape revenge uses these patriarchal institutions to emphasize fear of nonconformity and what happens when you deviate from the norm, as illustrated in the genre by this dichotomy of nature and industrialization present in these narratives. Traditionally, rape revenge has its own rules and iconography to maintain a distinguished genre position, but in the last few decades, it's taken on a hybrid narrative that extends beyond the respective formula. In this presentation, I'll be referring to the traditional rape revenge within the respective genre and transitional narrative for the purpose of viewing and discussing how castration is situated within the original formula. So rape revenge, as it's understood from its genre perspective and the contemporary expansion of the narrative, is really the only space where audiences can go into a movie expecting justice for rape in any form that it comes, in contrast to the extensive genres, productions, or franchises where rape can pop up as character development or minor plot points. Rape revenge films are a form of viewing justice dispensed by someone directly influenced by the crime, and not an apathetic judicial system or incompetent law enforcement. These films often make a point of clarifying the shortcomings of these institutions for rape victims. And this is an important point because these films formulate the idea that rape is the only avenue for justice. In the most traditional sense of the formula, the genre follows a 3-act structure in which the rape is committed in the first act, following some sort of taunting, stalking, or initiation between an individual or gang in pursuit of the victim. After surviving and recouping, vigilante justice is pursued by the victim or someone adjacent in the second act. This identifies the protagonist and their motive for vengeance. In the third act, the perpetrators face the punishment for their crime, with the level of severity dictated by the avenger. In rape revenge films, this traditionally means an execution, but not before the perpetrators meet the severity of their crime. Sometimes the vigilantes mirror the same phrases, use the same settings, or take an allegorical approach to reenacting the particular details of the crimes against the victim and to invoke the same fear. Castration, as a form of this reenactment, is so particular to rape revenge that it's become a classic motif of the genre and even a callback in modern narratives to the traditional format. You cannot distinguish castration in film and media without associating it with horror and sexual violence, and yet rape supersedes all genre classifications. Returning to the post-colonial standpoint of feminism, to discuss this idea of rebellion and deviation from heteronormative structures as being punishable by rape, I'll be discussing two genre-defining examples. The Last House on the Left came out in 1972. The protagonist is a teenager who's rebelling from her middle-class suburban home. She goes into the city to see a rock and roll band and attempts to buy drugs from a gang that kidnaps her and takes her to the woods behind her house where they rape and kill her. The gang then tries to walk up to her house and take advantage of her family, but the parents find out and kill them. I Spit in Your Grave from 1978 is an example of deviating from gender norms. The protagonist is an independent writer from a big metropolitan city who goes to the countryside to write her next great novel. The men who rape her punish her for this independence and success in the city that they will never achieve, which is an explicit parallel in the film. Both of the rapes and their revenges take place in nature, with castration as the leading point in this revenge. In The Last House on the Left, the mother bites the penis off of her daughter's attacker next to the lake where she found her daughter's body. In I Spit in Your Grave, the protagonist picks up the gang leader on his walk through the woods where she was raped, castrates him in her bathtub at her house before returning to the other gang members to kill them in the same marshes that they raped her in. The extreme violation of these female protagonists in their natural state and setting is what provokes the narrative of revenge. Both films spend most of their running time in the first act glorifying the sexual assault in order to justify what is done later. As soon as the perpetrators are killed, the film ends and her purpose is done. This colonizing construction of power is assumedly met with justice as the narrative ends, by equalizing sexual violence and castration as parallel to each other rather than one imitating the other. As an audience member, to view this as a form of justice and not a perpetuating narrative of colonial gender normativity, we view the castration as a construct of feminized vengeance and perception of justice, and not just a naturalized reflection of masculine violence. If you're interested in reading more of the details and expansion on other rape revenge films, I will be submitting my paper to the Digital Scholars Bank. Thank you for listening.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Joelle, for that presentation. It's really excellent. And it sort of speaks to some of the questions that I think were also raised in Billy's presentation. So I'm looking forward to our discussions that are going to come later. So thank you very much. Right. Our next presenter is Martha DeCosta, majoring in English with a creative writing minor. Martha's paper is entitled The Harp-Weaver, and Other Poems, A Haunting Maternal Presence in Edna St. Vincent Millay's Poetry. So thank you very much, Martha.
Thank you. I'm going to try to share my screen. I've got a presentation here. Can you see that? Awesome. Great. Well, thank you very much for this opportunity to present, and thank you all for supporting my research and being interested with me on this topic. My name is Martha, and this is my presentation. So my research came about when I read this volume during an English course on modern poetry. I became interested in Millay's work and discovered that there are very few literary sources that discuss what I call a haunting maternal presence. This term that I created refers to how the volume associates mothers and children with darker themes like death, imagined realities, and domestic distress, representing and embodying various forms of motherhood and not just traditional depictions of love. My research seeks to enhance the larger, perhaps limited, literary discourse about this theme in the Harp-Weaver and other poems. The first poem in the volume, My Heart Being Hungry, introduces motherhood by depicting a maternal speaker's despondent gaze on her body's emptiness. The heart is a common love symbol, but the speaker focuses on one that is hungry and ravenous out of desire. She laments her empty heart in lines 3 through 4, beauty where beauty never stood, and sweet where no sweet lies. The speaker depicts beauty and sweetness as distant, false fantasies, lamenting her unfulfilled desire, kind of like a complaining child. Her emptiness gets complicated when put into conversation with the pregnancy images that embody and describe the speaker. She portrays her future heart having achieved its girth in line 8, connoting an expectant belly. It's unusual, though, for her to discuss a hungry heart and not a hungry stomach. The bleak, self-focused contrasts with the typically joyful anticipation of children. The speaker goes on to predict that she will not find so beautiful the meager shapes of earth in lines 9 and 10. These images compare her full heart to the death of all things beautiful and sweet. The meager shapes may also depict a fetus in the womb, but the mother calls it an insignificant shape to detach herself from physical love. Her detachment shows that she rejects societal expectations for motherly care. A chilling image overshadows the poem in the final 2 lines, nor linger in the rain to mark the smell of tansy in the dark. At a surface level, the tansy, a yellow flowering plant, offsets the darkness with vivid beauty. However, the tansy is also a poisonous abortifacient, informing the poem's darker theme of emptiness. Although in very different ways, both the unborn child and the mother suffer deep loss. So Millay establishes the presence of children in the volume as an underlying anxiety and painful association with suffering. One literary scholar, Alyssa Zellinger, gives insight for the way that Millay incorporates her private life into poetry, since Millay herself had 2 abortions. Zellinger describes the traditional poetess displaying her private life with an innocent speaker whose vulnerability appeals to a male audience. However, Zellinger claims that Millay repurposes this female persona. Millay's public poetic self in this first poem blurs the line between her personal life and the female speaker by addressing the maternal struggles that follow abortion. It's risky, though, to conflate Millay's poetry with her personal life as a way to interpret her work. Instead, My Heart Being Hungry portrays how desperation for love influences a mother's difficult choice to validate rather than criticize maternal domestic burdens. A central poem that further explores domestic struggles in this volume is the famous Ballad of the Harp-Weaver. This rare perspective of a child speaker stands out in a volume that's otherwise dominated by adult speakers, giving insight to the son's traumatic experience watching his mother suffer. Ballads often follow these romanticized tales of love and death, but Millay complicates the seemingly traditionally packaged narrative. Contrasted with her son's effortless rhymes, the mother is a tragic figure who endures domestic hardship in solitude without the support of a husband. The only mention of a husband appears in the 6th stanza when she tells her son that she's lucky, that his daddy's in the ground and can't see the way she lets his son go around, in lines 22 through 26. Surprisingly, she expresses relief, the adjective lucky, over her husband's death, and she doesn't indicate remorse. This rejects a wife's traditional responsibility to love her husband, and love within marriage instead becomes painful to the mother who fills both parents' roles in her son's life. It's interesting to notice that the speaker, the son, refers to himself twice as a king's son, associating himself with an absent father figure. After his mother weaves him the red cloak, the son speculates, starting in line 99, that she's made it for a king's son, I said, and not for me, but I knew it was for me. He understands the cloak's purpose, but he denies and therefore downplays his mother's sacrificial work. This begs the question, why not call himself a queen's son, since his mother weaves the cloak? Millay doesn't give a clear answer, but the son's self-given title distances him from his mother. Following her death at the end of the ballad, spoiler alert, the final lines read, "Toppling to the skies were the clothes of a king's son, just my size." This final description maintains the son's objective tone while viewing this enormous, really fantastic pile of clothing. Yet the son only focuses on his provision. He doesn't thank his mother for her sacrifice. Millay here critiques the gendered trope that elevates male poetic figures by portraying the mother as the familial provider. The mother finds fulfillment in her son's well-being, and she demonstrates independence through her single-handed provision, since her care and attention don't rely on a husband's love or on her son's explicit gratitude. Millay's last collection in this volume, titled Sonnets from an Ungrafted Tree, further explores death as a wife cares for her dying husband. In an essay about the collection, the literary scholar Irene Fairley highlights the theme of familial disorder. Millay addresses the taboo topics of domestic distress and women's depression to challenge patriarchal presence in poetics at this time. Millay's Sonnet 12 continues the haunting maternal presence through unnerving images that compare the speaker's husband to an ailing child, an undesirable thing without a name or a gendered pronoun. This sonnet questions love versus duty for maternal figures at home. Few moments even suggest that the speaker loves her spouse. The first word of the poem, the adverb tenderly, reveals a perhaps affectionate care, and the speaker claims that she gives her husband of her body's strength in line 5. Taken without context, these details seem loving and selfless, but juxtaposed with the speaker's belittling characterization of her husband, it's more likely that she feels sorry for herself and not for him. Millay produces tension between this maternal wife and her helpless child husband. The speaker giving her husband her strength indicates that love is an endless task rather than a pleasurable experience. She describes the child husband through a troubling image in line 3, its small, feverish body, to express disdain. By othering her spouse, the speaker strips him of autonomy. Husbands and children are helpless things in line 6 that rely on maternal rescuing. This disassociates the speaker, a capable provider, from both men and children. Millay explores the non-traditional portrayal of children, typically subjects of maternal love, to disrupt the domestic institution of marriage. Rather than viewing caretaking as a wifely privilege, the job actually burdens and even repulses the speaker. In another literary essay, Artemis Michalidou says that Millay's poetry problematizes how society at this time thought marriage was women's ultimate success. And Michalidou argues that in this collection, quote, "There is no love involved in the relationship. The estranged wife returns because she is unable to shake off the sense of duty that still binds her to her husband," end quote. So Millay incorporates the subject of domestic distress in her poetics, disrupting feminine docility and ideas of domestic bliss. Like the speaker of the Ballad of the Harp-Weaver, the wife imagines fantasies of pleasure to escape her suffering in reality. She contrasts her dying husband with preferred dreams of freedom, and Millay personifies the night as the wife's secret visitor in line 8. Stealthily stirred the night and spoke to her. While the day consists of mothering the child husband, the wife welcomes the night as a lover, or maybe the comforting presence that she lacks in her spouse. The night represents escape from her monotonous reality, or on the other hand, the night might also symbolize death. This eerie fantasy incorporates the train image with a familiar friend, suggesting that the speaker welcomes these departure dreams. It's likely the wife sees an escape through her own demise and not just her husband's impending death. At the same time, the child husband, in line 14 called Something Asleep Beside Her, represents a barrier between the speaker and her dreams. Once again, Millay advocates that women's most freeing positions are neither as wives nor mothers, but independent self-caretakers. Millay's maternal representations that associate children and death really move beyond her personal life and speak to women's ignored experiences during her time. She pushes against the patriarchal influence on poetics in that all the husbands in this volume are either dead, sick, or otherwise removed. They're ultimately burdens of grief for the mothers and for the speakers. Overhanging depression and anxiety establish a unique female perspective, contrary to the romanticized versions of desire that many earlier poets preferred. My research scratches the surface by interrogating the limited literary discourse on the haunting maternal presence, but the Harp-Weaver and Other Poems volume invites further poetic exploration and representation of this really fascinating theme. Millay's volume should be more centralized and celebrated in poetics. Thank you for listening. And I will stop share. Here we go.
Thank you very much, Martha, for that rich and very interesting reading of Edna St. Millay's poetry. It's really excellent, wonderful. All right, our final presenter for today is Natalie North, majoring in percussion performance and music theater. Natalie's paper is entitled The Pearl of Santa Radegonda, an investigation into Chiara Margarita Cozzolani's musical fortune and success during the early to mid-Baroque era. Thank you very much, Natalie.
Thank you. Can you guys hear me okay? I know I'm wearing headphones. Okay, great. I do have a slideshow, and so I'm going to screen share that right now. Yes, and as Tera said, my presentation is on the Pearl of Santa Radegonda, which is an investigation into Chiara Margarita Cozzolani's musical fortune and success during the early to mid-Baroque era. After a brief introduction, I will provide a significant amount of historical context. Next, I will dive into some biographical information regarding Cozzolani. I will then break down this concept of two legacies. The first that was caused by both the contemporaneous Milanese culture and her fortunate upbringings. The second iteration of her legacy solely occurred because musicologist Robert Kendrick painstakingly researched the primary sources of Italian women religious while particularly focusing on only Cozzolani's biographical information. My presentation will provide a new perspective as to how her life and compositional style led to her securing two different legacies 300 years apart. As a musician, I'm sometimes surprised at how important music is to everyone. I call it a necessary commodity. Early hominids could have easily discontinued this art form because in what way did music benefit their survival? Similarly, according to musicologist Satyaki Banerjee, music is the most ephemeral form of art. It is only with modern recording techniques that music is more than just a memory. Recently, with the age of YouTube and SoundCloud, there is this relative ease of composing and publishing like never before. This is only a recent advancement in the musical world, as we will see the success and decline of Cozzolani, given only her surroundings. let me now set the stage with some historical context. Italy does not unify as a nation until 1871, which provides the Italian citizens with quite a bit of freedom, but it also ensures invasion from neighboring kingdoms. In 1540, Milan was officially annexed by Spanish Habsburg rule. Despite its annexation and rulings by Spanish dukes, Milan was actually governed by 60 wealthy patriciate families. These families controlled imports, exports, but most importantly for Cozzolani, music composition and monastic life. In fact, Milan was a hotspot for visiting aristocrats to add to their collection of listening experiences. This picture depicts the Benedictine convent and Duomo of Santa Radegonda in Milan. As one can see, city life centers around these two buildings. It would be rather difficult to keep women religious cloistered when their convent doors opened up onto a busy street. While the Pope attempted to separate convent familial ties, Milan took this as a suggestion. In fact, during the 17th century, 75% of the patriciate or genteel women were in Milanese monasteries. This was due to the fact that the general populace immensely respected women religious. They were seen as the perpetual intercessors of the city. Oddly enough, Milan specifically is known for monastic architects who saw the nuns as more than slaves who deserved natural light and gardens. Monasteries were also seen as a large source of free labor. For example, the highly acclaimed Milanese monasteries, such as Santa Radegonda, were involved in the silk industry. However, it is important to note that Milan was the exception. The majority of women religious lived in cloistered or essentially restricted, imprisoned environments. Typically at the age of 17, or even as young as 7, these women or girls would take their final vows of chastity and never see their family again while working as a slave to launder the nobility's undergarments. The Council of Trent's papal mandates should have ended Milan's patriciate rule of the monasteries, but it utterly failed. Taking place from 1545 to 1563, it was a response to Martin Luther's Protestant Reformation. And thus, the Council of Trent embodied the Counter-Reformation, which secured the sanctity and power of Catholicism. This started with reining in the nuns, who seemed to be having too much fun and freedom, talking with their relatives, making their vows a public family affair, and worst of all, singing polyphonic music. The Pope issued a mandate stating they, the women religious, will abstain from singing either in choir or elsewhere, the so-called figured chant. Figured chant is another term for polyphonic music. While this may seem like a menial statute, this outraged Italian women religious. This was viewed as the first step to controlling their God-given rights to sing. It would be a Hildegard von Bingen episode all over again. Especially for Milan, this should have undermined their entire monastic musical personality. To further seal the deal, the Pope assigned an overseeing archbishop to each city that would ensure the nuns did not break any rules. In 1602, Chiara Margarita was born into the well-known silk-producing patriciate Cozzolani family. As was typical for every woman during the 17th century, to make her more attractive as a bride or nun, she took music lessons growing up. She took them from the Rognoni family, a family friend. As she was not the eldest born daughter, the life of a nun was her calling. But fortunately for her, at Santa Radegonda, she would be in the company of 2 aunts, a sister, and 2 nieces. This is clearly a case of the failed attempt of the papacy to keep families apart in the monasteries, as I mentioned earlier. In fact, Milanese convents were seen more as a place to safely and more cost-effectively house a lot of patriciate female family members, while at the same time keeping the city holy. Luckily for Cozzolani, she started to compose at the convent after the more conservative archbishops had departed. Federico Borromeo would go on art collection sprees while also providing musical instruments and lessons to the nuns. Cozzolani started to prolifically compose during Cesare Monti's reign. Monti wanted to glorify the city even more than Borromeo. This meant that the women religious within Santa Radegonda were essentially left alone for days without an archbishop, reveling in their freedom, while singing at an open doorway to the city. Cozzolani quickly became Maestra di Capella, or the choir master, which encouraged her to compose even more. In fact, she published more music than any other contemporaneous Milanese composer, male or female, during 1640 to 1650. It is uncertain as to how she afforded to publish as much as she did, but she was known for her economically wise dedications. In 1640, Milanese-born Joelle published her first work, Primavera dai Fiori Musicali, a collection of motets which she dedicated to her very own archbishop, Cesare Monti. It is possible that he paid for this publication out of sheer generosity. Her Concerti Sacri of 1642 was dedicated to one of the traveling aristocrats, Prince Matthias de' Medici, who used a Venetian publisher. This ensured that Cozzolani's music would be heard further than the convent walls of Santa Radegonda. Alfonso Lita, on the other hand, was extremely conservative and kept Santa Radegonda in check. Perhaps it was Cozzolani's position as prioress and then abbess, or Lita's conservative nature, but from 1652 onwards, there are no known compositions of hers. This proves that her first compositional success was guaranteed by her fortunate surroundings, while furthermore proving that all it took was one person, one man specifically, in a position of authority to completely undermine her first compositional legacy. Before Lita's tenure as archbishop, Cozzolani was a prolific composer, as she wrote and published 4 books of sacred music. This may seem like a small feat compared to the overall production of her male contemporaries, but she composed and published more music than any other Milanese nun during the 17th century. As I've mentioned before, with her wise dedications, her pieces circulated in Germany, France, and England, which was rare for even male composers to achieve, let alone a female nun in captivity. Cozzolani was also a smart and relatable composer. By having her compositional style focus on an individual's piety, people hearing and performing her works felt like they were personally praising God. Here we have an excerpt from one of her motets, Ocelli Cives. She employs this unique, conversational, polyphonic style between a lower voice type, the tenores, represented by the T's, and a higher voice type, the canti, represented by the C's. The voice type levels also represent one's place on earth versus one's place in heaven. Tenores, the faithful, canti, the angels. She also employs some advanced compositional techniques for her time, with the use of changing key centers through the circle of fifths and fourths, as well as secondary dominants. The importance of this analysis is to show that she primarily composed forbidden polyphonic music in a complex manner that showed off her prowess as a composer. I'm now going to play a bit of this example, and I hope that it actually plays. Okay. For me, this music is so exciting. You can see how the Canti 1, the melodic line, rises and falls, as well with the rising of the circle of fifths and the descending of the circle of fourths. Cozzolani was respected and well known during her lifetime. However, soon after her death, her music, along with the compositions of her women religious contemporaries, they seemed to disappear. During the late 17th century, there were also stricter papal mandates put in place to further control monastic music. Similarly, there was a change in the Italian compositional style. Music started to be produced by male composers who would be commissioned by wealthy amateur musicians wanting music to play in the home. This made Cozzolani's efforts to publish from a convent seem futile. In fact, it has only been within the past 25 years that musicologists such as Robert Kendrick and Craig Monson have seen the importance in unearthing the compositions of women religious, such as Cozzolani, to give them a second legacy. It appears that Chiara Margarita's luck never truly went away. As I was researching this woman, it kept surprising me how her entire life seemed to go according to plan. However, it was a sad revelation that had it not been for her fortunate happenstances, would anyone be aware of her music? Isabella Leonarda and Barbara Strozzi were 2 women who continued to be referenced in monographs about early modern Italy. Just like Cozzolani, they came from wealthy, well-known families within cities that were run by the bourgeoisie, had an equally fantastic musical education, and, given their non-existent marriage status, they could devote their life to composing. This led to their first legacy. They also all had records of their existence and published works which allowed for recent musicologists to provide modern recorded performances of their compositions, which ensured their second legacy. Ironically, despite constant papal mandates trying to further stifle the creativity of convents, more women emerged as composers in Italy between 1566 and 1700 than in any other previous period in Western music history. Unfortunately, it has only been within the past 25 years that musicologists have started to realize the importance of women religious as viable learning opportunities for collegiate students. And thus, I beg of current researchers to look beyond Giulio Caccini and Arcangelo Coeli and discover these cloistered gems of women religious composers who've been waiting for their well-deserved publishing deal, even if it is 300 years late. I hope to have the opportunity to investigate more into the lives and compositional styles of these incredibly brilliant, fiery, and talented women who have fought for women's compositional rights that I get to take for granted today. And so I leave you with this. Listen to music from artists you don't know in honor of those who possibly will never be heard. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Natalie, for introducing us to Cozzolani's legacy. Wonderful. So thank you very much to all four of our presenters for those really excellent and inspiring presentations. Now we're going to be transitioning to our Q&A. So attendees and panelists, if you have questions for anyone who's spoken today, I'll ask you to signal that in the webinar chat. If you'd prefer to ask your question out loud, that's fine too. Just let us know in the chat box and I'll be mediating these questions. So I see here that Natalie has a question. Let's see, for Joelle. Have you seen a certain decade that has a severe incline in the rape revenge genre? If there is a certain decade, is there a historical reason?
Let me unmute myself. I'm happy you asked that. When I started this project, I originally wanted to talk about the more abstracted, allegorical or metaphorical use of castration, and how it's showing up in sort of contemporary feminist films. Even sort of jokingly, like I was really obsessed with Jennifer's Body growing up, and then I got older and I was like, oh wow, this is a great movie. But you're asking me, has there been a severe incline? So I kind of touched on it in my presentation, but I went through it really quickly. There's a bit of a discussion within the academic sphere of whether or not rape revenge should be respected as a genre or if it should transition into a narrative. I argue that that it has since turned into a narrative, so we can kind of see it in an incline with contemporary films, especially with the most recent Me Too movement. So I would argue that it's not necessarily more films are being made within the genre, but we are seeing this sort of representation of either metaphorical or physical or just castration or just regular rape revenge showing up repeatedly in many genres, as well as big blockbuster films and sort of more minor indie films. Thank you.
Wonderful. And a question from Martha for Natalie. What or who originally sparked your deep interest in Cozzolani and her legacy?
Yeah, so this is a great question. As a music major, I am required to take an entire year of music history broken up into 3 terms. And so last term, for the winter term, I was asked by my teacher to write a paper on a female composer. And so I ended up choosing Cozzolani. And the other thing I want to make really important and emphasize is that Cozzolani had a significant amount of information about her in comparison to a lot of other female composers that I might have had an interest in, but it's simply that they do not have as much scholarship, research, and documentation that essentially stopped me and prohibited me from researching them further. Otherwise, I'd have to learn Italian in a term. And so it's this whole concept of Cozzolani is actually this very unique individual who has all this legacy and this research and the scholarship surrounding her that allows me to, have the presentation that I have today.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Natalie. Here is a question from our audience. Holly has a question for Joelle and Natalie, saying that Martha's presentation has made me think about the expression of the self on the part of the creators and how self-expression appears in artistic output. Do you see the presence of the creator's self-expression in rape revenge films and in the compositions of Cozzolani? And if so, what role does this play in your research?
Do you want to go first, Natalie, or should I?
I can go first. This is actually my teacher from that winter term music theory class. Yes, so thanks, Holly. So the thing that I find most important about this concept of the creator's self-expression within the composition of Cozzolani is that as Cozzolani was an essentially what should have been a cloistered nun within the convent of Santa Radegonda, in some of her works, and we saw this in the musical example that I played, is that she has these pauses almost in between this conversational style. And so first of all, the conversational style reflects a sense of just her entire life, these nuns conversing with each other, having discourse, and trying to have as normal of a life as possible. However, the pauses that are extremely important could reflect possibly a godly reflection, and they're talking to God and waiting for God to answer to them. Or in my opinion, it reflects more on the sense of them having their entire lives be put on hold since they were old enough to realize, I mean, this could be at the age of 3 that they were old enough to realize that since they were not the eldest born daughter in their family, that they would have to enter an essentially imprisoned lifestyle. And so I definitely feel that there is a huge amount of self-expression given Cozzolani's life presented and was represented in her compositions. Thank you for that question.
And for me, I think in the tradition of rape revenge historically has been exploitation, and exploitation has been largely dominated by white cis heterosexual men. So the self-expression, I don't think that, what is it? I'm sorry. Expression appears in artistic output. I don't think that there's an expression of self from the creators. I think it's an expression of the creators' desires, as well as sort of this, oh shoot, oh my God, sorry. I don't think it's an expression of the creators. I think it's an expression of their desires and their, a transition from the sexploitation era into the exploitation, or into rape revenge, sorry.
Wonderful. Thank you, Natalie and Joelle, for those wonderful answers. We have another question from our audience. This comes from Corbett. A question for Martha. You mentioned that Millay resists traditional depictions of love and motherhood in this volume. Is this unique to Millay's work, or were there other women poets at the time, 1920s, writing about this?
Thank you for that question, Dr. Upton. I would say that there were definitely other female poets of Millay's time, so late 1890s through the 1950s especially, who explored different portrayals of love. H.D. Hilda Doolittle is the one that comes to mind. And female poets like this, including Millay, were really important to the modernist poetry movement, which sort of moved away from romantic poetry by redefining love, beauty, and truth. So instead of glorifying these romanticized themes in their writing, the modernist poets kind of said, forget this, we're going to do something new. And they kind of explored what poetry can talk about. So suffering, anxiety, loss, death during World War II really became topics. And these female poets and male poets too, but especially the women, described love and beauty in desolate places, which was contrary to the romantics. So I'd say that Millay was especially influential in introducing female and maternal struggles into the modernist movement. But there were definitely other women poets at the time writing about these themes, and even post-modernist poets who came after Millay, like Anne Sexton is one, and then Sylvia Plath is another well-known female poet who especially talked about love in different areas, not just traditional depictions of love. So, yeah.
Thank you, Martha. And I have a question here from Martha for Billy. Have you seen pragmatic abstraction in other areas of study outside of philosophy? And do you think you will continue to explore this topic?
Yeah, thank you for that question. I've been thinking about this a bunch and talking to my advisor for my thesis about this. And I think that I see the tool of pragmatic abstraction being used in economics with the type of money that we have today, where money used to just be very tactile and measured in terms of what was concretely there. So say if I had a rabbit to trade, it was worth solely just this one rabbit. But today we have this one piece of paper that has a number printed on it. That means this one piece of paper can have a value of 50 times itself, just given that, you know, the tool of pragmatic abstraction that we use, we could take it beyond what's presently there and trade with it and understand its value. So I think it has a presence in economics, and I think it has a presence in history too, usually in problematic ways where pragmatic abstraction is the way one interprets something is imposed upon others and is interpreted in terms of just one perspective, and that could be problematic. And I think given that issue, I really want to keep pursuing it because it seems like a fundamental tool to really look into in a bunch of different contexts. Thank you for that question.
Wonderful. And another question for Billy. This is coming from Natalie. Do you see the reasonable woman standard seen in more cases than just sexual harassment lawsuits?
Oh, good question. I did not do any research in past the sexual harassment cases, but I can speculate. Let's see. I can really see it being used. It's a more recent adoption for legal standards. I'm trying to think, maybe some sort of like negligence cases where some people have, I don't know. I could see it being used outside, but I'm not in law school yet, so I can't specifically go into what areas it would be in, but you know, I really hope it's used, and it doesn't have to just be the reasonable woman standard, but the reasonable XYZ, make it more contextualized. So I hope that it can extend. Thank you for that thoughtful question.
Great. Well, I have a question, if it's all right for me to intervene here. So Martha posed this question for Natalie, and now I'd like to pose it to be the rest of the panelists, and then Natalie, if you have anything else to add. But if you could tell us a little bit about how you got interested or involved in your research. So what brought you to this point?
I can go. I said at the beginning of my presentation, but I took a English modern poetry course, so English 475 last term, and we read a bunch of modernist poets that included Millay. And so my first introduction to Millay was in that course, actually with Dr. Upton. It was really fun. And so I got interested in Millay's volume that we read, and as I was reading, kind of started picking up on this theme of the haunting maternal presence, as I later called it. So I've been taking poetry as a minor basically for the past 4 years, but had never encountered Millay. So reading her work was really cool because it kind of brought together all my interests of study, and was a great opportunity to dive into one specific poet and her work. So, yeah.
Me, you? Okay. So I got interested in my topic from taking a philosophy upper division class 463 on William James. He's also a pragmatist, and he sparked my interest in pragmatism. I really was enjoying the practical aspect of it, the fact that it deals with the real world, what's really in front of us, not just something that we think about. And overall, I really think my philosophy degree just kept piling on reasons why I should really dive into pragmatism, but also abstraction, because the more I think about it, not only the more I use it because I need it to think, but the more that I find it applies to many different things. And that's what sparked my interest, was philosophy courses, and then just continuing to think about it as the courses went on.
So for me, I was taking a film course, and there was a film that I didn't want to watch because there was a metaphorical rape scene in it. And I tried to explain that to my professor, and I was saying, I can watch it at home, but this is a night class. I don't want to walk 40 minutes after, alone after watching this. And the professor basically said, you're misunderstanding it. There's a reason why we're viewing this, and it's because which I guess kind of ties into the question from before. Basically, the professor said, this is meant to sort of punish the man for what he did before. So the woman who is raping him now, he's being punished for it. And I really disagreed, and he pointed me to several materials, and I still really disagreed. So I wrote a very passionate final paper that he disregarded. And I said, I'm not done yet. So then I took up this area of interest, and I'm very happy that I did, because I think that there's so many different ways that you can go with it, and so many different interpretations, as well as different lenses of feminism to view rape and castration.
Thank you very much. We have another question from Holly. For all panelists, where do you envision your research developing from here? Will you continue with these projects, or take certain concepts and continue in another direction?
I can start. As a music theory major, I also have the opportunity to have a junior project, a senior project, as well as a junior and senior colloquium, which essentially means it's a lot of researching for the rest of my time here. And what I hope to actually do is to study more about just the impact of female composers throughout a certain timeline, and also to a certain extent of how their work had to be censored to continue to be published. There is this work by Madame Ethel Smith in the early 1900s, who was an opera writer, and she wrote this opera called The Wreckers. And essentially what this was about sirens, but in a very several layers of irony and satire. And the only way that she could actually essentially make fun of men who saw women as just sirens, these mythological creatures who would have these boatsmen be hit up against the rocks and then steal from them. She's making fun of that and the fact that why are women just seen as these mythological creatures, first of all, but as essentially theft, and they're thieves, and so that's what I would like to do further, is just more research on female composition and how censorship has affected their works and their compositional lifestyle.
Did I go? Oh, you want to go, Martha? Okay, I'll go. This project, I knew that I wanted to go into film, but I wasn't really sure if I wanted to go into production or remain within academia. So this project really cemented film theory for me. I don't know. I would like to develop my research further, as I was talking about earlier. Sort of now that I have this sort of base understanding, I can sort of delve into the more metaphorical use of castration and rape, and as well as looking at men who were raped on film, because I don't think that that is discussed a lot. So yeah.
For me, I'm graduating in 2 weeks, so in an academic setting, unless I do grad school, I won't be able to academically continue to research this particular topic. But in my personal time and throughout the rest of my life, I do hope to continue to read poems, write poetry, and help to represent women in different ways. This project specifically talks about women and mothers, maternity. So that's a theme that I've seen in a lot of other novels that I've been reading, like Beloved by Toni Morrison, for example. And so that's kind of cool because I guess in a way I can take this project and branch it out into my readings and my just personal interests as an English major and creative writing minor. So I would say that I'd like to continue reading and writing about these themes, but I don't know how much specifically academic research I'll be able to do. Again, my project was kind of to sort of start the conversation about this theme because it's not something that I've been able to find sources on. There aren't that many people talking about haunting maternal presence in this specific volume. So I tried to kind of fill a gap there with the research. And in doing so, I guess just out of an interest and to spark conversations with friends and with researchers who haven't noticed this theme. So that's kind of a long-winded question, but yeah.
For me, I kind of alluded to it before. I think I'll continue thinking about the tool of pragmatic abstraction, not necessarily in the context of a philosophical work like How We Think by John Dewey, but I think I'll be keeping in mind my research about some of the problematic aspects of it, where it can very much overshadow one perspective and in a problematic way where people's experiences are ignored. So I think I'm going to keep that in mind from the research I've done and most likely apply it to the field of law. And I'd like to keep that in mind. So that's where I envision it going for me.
Great, thank you very much. We have another question for Joelle here. Your insights about this genre are very helpful. Have you discovered any filmmakers, particularly women filmmakers, who challenge the rape revenge narrative in productive ways?
So for this project, I really had to try and limit myself to what I was going to focus on. My original scope was gigantic, and I really had to tie it down to what exactly I was trying to say, which is really difficult for me. So I haven't had a lot of opportunity to look at or to even sort of conceptualize what feminist rape revenge would even look like. But it does bring up these questions of, you know, at what point would both the, you know, the victim and the audience feel that justice is served and that it's represented, and what's the balance between sort of, you know, I was talking about like Act 1 and versus Act 3, the actual sexual violence, the sexual violation versus the retribution or the justice, and where does the line between justice and revenge sort of get drawn. But I think that feminist filmmakers are probably grappling with that idea, and they are out there. I just haven't had the time to look at them yet.
Great, thank you, Joelle. I have a question here for all of the panelists, and I think some of you have alluded to this already, but perhaps you could speak a little more explicitly about maybe what challenges you've overcome while working on this project, whether it's a matter of scope or any other issues you might have run into while you were working on this.
I could start with this one, I think. That's a question that I've had in my mind with this project the whole time. What I've been having trouble with is particularly trying to not conflate the process of pragmatic abstraction with the process of reflective thought, given that they're both double movements, and I think it was all right for me to talk about them separately, but when I bring them in conversation with each other, I do have some trouble not bringing them together and trying to keep them distinct and clearly talking about this and that, and like I just said, not conflating them. That's a difficulty I've had.
I'll go next. So a challenge that I found with researching is this whole difficulty, especially with having to fit it within just a 12-minute oral presentation here, is I had to essentially cut a lot of information about what it means to be a cloistered nun, and also the fact that Cozzolani's life was completely separate on the other end of the spectrum of what actually was the norm. I said this in just one sentence in my presentation, that, you know, typically at the age of 7 to 17, that these women and girls they would enter this life that they had no idea about. They possibly could never see their family again since that very young age. And they possibly would know no one in this foreign city and not know any of the different little cultural aspects. And essentially their life would just be a launderer or a silk manufacturer. And I wish that I could have gone into more detail about that, because the other thing is that these women were also extremely fiery, oppositional people. And so actually there's this one case in, Santa, I want to say it's Niccolo di Strozzi, and it's this, it's an arson, actually. The top nuns at this, they decided to set the entire building on fire because they were so outraged by what these old white Italian male archbishops were trying to do to them, to, again, cloister what they're doing, and especially to cloister their creativity and their compositions. And so I wish I could have gone into more detail about that. And so I appreciate that question for me to kind of speak to that subject specifically.
I think a few challenges for me included doing close readings of the poems in this volume, because it is time consuming and it's really detailed work to interpret poetry and to go through every poem in the whole volume to look for this specific theme of maternal presence. Another challenge I found was that there aren't that many sources that talk about this theme, as I've said. So I kind of had to pioneer my own research and present my ideas with a lot of help from my advisor, Dr. Upton, actually, and just kind of come up with my own original ideas, which is a lot harder than drawing from other people's thoughts. So that was a challenge, but a good one at that. I think another challenge I faced was just condensing my research, because I found about 10 poems in this entire volume that reference this topic, but I only talked about 3 briefly in my presentation, and I really could have dived in more about each of these specific poems. So I think it was challenging to kind of figure out what was the most important that I wanted to say, what takeaway messages, and what specific things were, I guess, yeah, more important or more major than other aspects of the poems, if that makes sense.
So for me, I talked about narrowing my focus, but once I had that narrowed, it was really hard because there's about 5 theorists who are working off of each other. So all of their references are referencing 2 other people's books and their articles, and you go and look at the book and it's referencing an article from the first primary source. So they're all working together, and so you have to really understand where each of the authors' perspectives is and what their theory is and what their underlying definitions of the genre, of the narrative, of what they're even speaking to are, in order for you to understand the argument that they're making in reflection to somebody else's work. So that was difficult. And then sort of more like if I wanted to take more of a personal approach and not just reiterating, like Martha said, what other scholars had put, I needed to bring in other source material that was somehow, kind of related, but not directly. And that was difficult as well. And I tried to keep it mostly within women and feminist scholars, because I like their perspectives more. Which was actually really easy with this. So that was mostly the scope.
Thank you very much. Those were all very enlightening answers for me. I have a bit of a follow-up question here. You've all presented such beautiful work, and you've made such important theoretical interventions in your fields. But this question here, if you could go back in time and start this project fresh, is there anything you would do differently in approaching your topic? And if so, what would that be?
For me, if I were to start fresh, I probably would have just jumped in to what I originally wanted to talk about. I have this base understanding now, and I both am really, really kind of over the topic, as well as really wanting to jump in a lot more, but in a different direction. So I probably, if I could start fresh, I would have started with my original sort of metaphorical, allegorical approach, and focused less on defining the genre and more on, or defining like the formula, and more on focusing on contemporary aspects and how rape and rape revenge are represented metaphorically in contemporary film.
I think if I could go back, I might compare Millay to other female poets at her time or maybe in the future, because I didn't really get a chance to dive into that in my research, but that would be really interesting to compare maternal presence in these new and unique ways that she's presenting it in other poems and other poets' representations, and just kind of see how that is in conversation with each other, or how it evolves and changes over time. I could do that on my own, just as an interest in my research, but that's something I probably would have changed.
I think that if I could go back, I would relate it to what my Professor Roberts was asking, this question of if there is any sort of self-expression actually in the creations. And so I would want to realize and just study that more and see if there are actually like some true and scholarship worthy examples of Cozzolani's life that can then actually directly be seen in her music. And so I'd like to look into that more.
I think if I could redo it, I'd like to look into maybe another example outside the realm of law. I tried the one with money, the economics one that I discussed briefly before, but my advisor really wasn't having it, so I kind of ex-nayed that. And yeah, maybe just more exploration in examples.
Wonderful, thank you very much. As we're in the last 5 minutes of our session, I'm just going to ask now, are there any other questions that you'd like to pose, either our guests or the presenters themselves? Any last inquiries that you have for each other?
I think I have a question for all the panelists. Where do you think I guess this was already posed, but where do you think the field that, say, we all researched in is going, given the current scholarship and what's happening in academia right now? Where do you think y'all's field of interest and research is going currently?
I can answer that first. There's this article out recently by Eugene Yates, I want to say, and it's this concept of where are all the women composers? And for me, there's, especially for the past 25 years with musicologists Robert Kendrick and Craig Monson, for example, there's this concept of actually like unearthing and reimagining the lives and the compositional styles of especially convent life when it comes to these composer nuns. But essentially, it also has this concept of where are the women in other parts of Western music. And there's also this association of why is there always a male attached to a female composer. We have this woman named Clara Schumann, but we only know Clara Schumann because she was the wife of the well-known and respected composer in my field, Robert Schumann. This is in the early 19th century. And so it brings this correlation of like, well, then also why do we have women on gravestones that always have to have a correlation with their husband or their brother? So there's a lot of different concepts that relate to everyday life and not just with music. But I think for me, the most important question to ask is not where are all the women composers, because I know where they are. They are literally everywhere. For me, it's more of the concept of why have they been erased from history, and why is this still happening?
That's a really good question, Natalie. I like that a lot. I might steal that for my area as well. I think for English and for poetry, for the U of O specifically, these female poets are being very well represented in what is taught in school. And so I'd say that with the areas of study that I'm in right now, I think that's a really positive thing, I would hope. You know, it's being more explored and talked about in classes. It's being better represented than it was, say, when I was a high schooler, when Robert Frost was the poet that we focused on and not other modernist poets of the era. So I think there's a good leap happening right now, especially in English, just for representation of women and an opportunity for students to explore their work and actually talk about it in really interesting and challenging ways.
I don't 100% remember what the question was, but I understand where we're going with the women. I think that translates well into cinema as well, especially with we're having conversations of why haven't there been women in the film industry and how their jobs have been minimized to the point and then recognized for their potential, and then the women are kicked out of the room and the men come in and do those jobs. And I think now we're sort of recognizing the need for these storytellers because men aren't able to tell the same stories, and I think we're just starting to recognize that, and that works the same for film theory as well.
Nice. Yeah. If I could answer along the same lines, I think my answer would be just, things are becoming more unearthed and more in the context of how things actually were. Nothing's really being covered up. Well, that's kind of a sweeping statement, but I think progressively, as we're moving forward, we're, at least philosophy, certain philosophies, I think pragmatism is very much getting involved with the material conditions, how things come about, given how we're situated, and I like that advancement that's coming about.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Billy, for that great closing question. And thank you to everyone for your responses. I just want to give a general thank you and a round of applause to our panelists. You know, you would hear the round of applause if we were in a room together, but thank you for your brilliant and engaging work. It's been great to have this opportunity to really recognize and celebrate your scholarship. And I want to extend a thank you to everyone for your wonderful questions and your answers. And I think we'll end it there. But yes, I wish you all the best in your future endeavors and look forward to seeing what you do after this. So thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you. Nice meeting you all.
Thank you.